Okay, so it is 6:30. I'm going to have a drink and start the meeting officially. So welcome everybody to this meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers. This meeting is about local oyster catchers, which means it is mostly about black oyster catchers, those being the species that we mostly have. I'm going to talk about black oyster catchers a little bit, what they look like, what's fun about them. I'm going to talk a little bit about their breeding behavior because we did have an attempted nesting in Carpinteria a few years ago, so that was exciting. And then I'm going to talk about these sort of ID challenges when you get an oyster catcher that looks different, and whether it's an American oyster catcher or whether it's a black American oyster catcher hybrid, and why that's important to people who want to play the game of their, year list or life list and get new species on their life list. So that's basically it. A quick announcement before we get started officially. This Saturday, we will have an outing, our usual monthly outing. It will be at the Carpinteria Bluffs, and we're going to be meeting at the Baylord Avenue parking, so sort of the main parking area for the Bluffs proper. It'll be at 8 a.m. on Saturday. Birds are up early, so and the plan is we're going to meet at the parking lot. We're going to walk down to the harbor seal pupping site, the overlook there, because that is kind of a good spot around here to see a black oyster catcher. What's that? So the seal pupping site, you're up on the bluff. You're like separate from the seals, but you can look down on them as they hang out on the beach.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, so that should be fun. I hope people can come out for that. It looks like we won't have rain, which is good. And so, hope to see some of you then, again, Saturday at 8. And I think that is it for announcements. So let's do oyster catchers. And for this, I'm going to share my screen. And I think I want to do this, and I don't think I need that. And I got a few more things to do. Okay, so let's talk about oyster catchers. I really like oyster catchers. I'm not sure exactly why some birds are more fun for me than others, but oyster catchers are very fun for me. I think partly it's that they're sort of big and big personalities, and I just think they're really cool looking, and they're kind of unambiguous. There are birders who really like the really hard to ID birds, like the fine distinctions between two very similar species really gets them excited. And I'm more like, I just want an easy ID and just enjoy the bird. So oyster catchers satisfy that desire for me most of the time. Although again, at the end of the meeting, we'll talk about when it actually does get tricky. They like to live, well, they exclusively live along the coast, the western US and the Pacific coast of Mexico, and in the Gulf of California, I think also. We have the black oyster catcher species out here on the Pacific coast. There is the American oyster catcher that people back east are familiar with on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. And then there's this little bit of hybrid / overlap down in Mexico that we'll talk about. But around here, if you see an oyster catcher, it is almost certainly a black oyster catcher. And they look like this. This bird I actually saw on the Christmas count this past year for Carpinteria. And it wasn't unique for the count. We already had black oyster catchers from down in Ventura County at the Rincon Island group that was out there. And I think maybe even Hugh, you guys might have had one at on the pelagic trip.
Yes, on the Rincon Island.
Yeah, it is like if around here, if you really want to see a black oyster catcher, Rincon Island is a good place to go check out if you can get there. If you've got a boat or if you get special permission to go out the causeway. But this is the old oil drilling artificial island down there a little bit south of here near Mussel Shoals. Oyster catchers like mussels. This one is perched in that rocky habitat with a bunch of mussels there. That's what they tend to feed on is, crustacean bivalves, I guess those are mollusks. That big beak is useful for getting access to the insides of mussels. They pretty much stay put. They don't really migrate around. There's a little bit of movement that they can do to go to favored wintering sites. And I'm not super expert, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. But in reading about them, you will sometimes in the winter months see big groupings of them, especially up along the northern parts of the Pacific coast, where they'll go to favorable areas and congregate there. You'll see a bunch at one time. And then during the breeding season, they breed along the coast. They're basically always along the coast. But this was a larger group of them that I saw one day in 2022 near the mouth of Carpinteria Creek. So that was fun. And again, I just, I think they're very fun to watch. They're just active. Like this one, like scampering as another one came flying in. It was neat to see them all that day. I will talk a little bit about more like official information about them. See if I can, yeah, I'm gonna go back and we're gonna go look. This is a little bit, yeah, here we go. So here's the eBird page, the eBird species page for black oyster catcher. Here are some better photos. You can get a really good look at them there. So this is a young one, and something kind of, whoops, I'll go back. Something kind of cool about the young oyster catchers is up until about 2 years or first year, second year birds, the distal part, the tip of the beak is not yet all orange. They don't get the all orange beak until they're a little bit older. So this is a young one. Yeah, they're very fun to see. Here's some displaying, which again, yeah, they're very distinctive. For me, when I first saw them, it was like, wow, those are so cool. I'm really excited. Like it's one of those birds that I saw in the field guide and kind of always thought it'd be neat to see them, but then it was a long time before I actually saw one. So when I did, it felt really special. And as I was talking about here, well, this is in August, so forget what I said about only in the winter. Here's a big group of them hanging out up in British Columbia in August. I also wanted to share what they sound like because it is cool. You will hear them a lot. Quite loud, so you can hear them over the surf. Different vocalizations you make. You can hear one in the distance answering back here. Let's see. I just get a kick out of that. So around here, like if you go to Santa Cruz Island or Anacapa, the local islands is a really good place to see them. They tend to be in evidence out there. Here is Steve Colwell's Bird View app showing all the eBird checklists since 2023 with oyster catchers in Santa Barbara County. So you can see here's all the black oyster catcher sightings, and you see they really are a bunch of them out there on the Channel Islands, but also along the coast. If you've got some suitable rocky habitat, especially like the northern coast of Santa Barbara County, up here at Vandenberg and points north. Not so much on the south coast, but a few records. And then also American oyster catchers, which we will talk about at the end of the meeting. So on we go. Let's see, another resource that I'll point out, let me reload this, is Paul Lehman's Birds of Santa Barbara County. We are very lucky to have Paul Lehman in the meeting. So it's a good chance for me to express my gratitude to all the work he has done over the years of documenting the status and distribution of all the bird species ever recorded in Santa Barbara County. So if you go to this page, and all of these sites I'm looking at, these are all linked from the webpage at carpbirdwatchers.org for this meeting. There's a long list of links that'll take you to all these resources. But you can go, to Birds of Santa Barbara County and look up any species and get sort of a summary of where they're found in the county. It mentions they're a rare visitor, primarily during migration along the south coast, where one nesting record, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because that was exciting. But there's a bunch more detail there that I encourage you to check out. Okay, and we will keep on slide showing. Oh, okay, so this is an observation, a photo I took associated with that one nesting record. And I'm going to show you a couple of other things. in connection with this. The first thing I'm going to show you is the eBird page for the hotspot for the Carpinteria Bluffs seal hulla. This is where we're going to be going on Saturday. It mentions, iconic birds is this new feature that eBird has added to their hotspot pages that is kind of cool. So it mentions black oystercatcher as an iconic bird for this location, which is a pretty good way of putting it. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, it's not like you see them all the time, but it's, if you go there, a number of times, there's a pretty good chance you're going to see some at some point. There you go. Yeah, and if you're going to hang out there for hours at a time, your odds go way up. Let's see. So this page that I linked to at carpbirdwatchers.org, the same site I was mentioning earlier, is an article I put there back in 2021 talking about this breeding attempt at the Carpinteria Bluffs. And basically, this is a photo that Dave Ledig shared showing a black oystercatcher on its nest right there at the seal pupping site. So oystercatchers nest along the coast, and like snowy plovers that nest along, the shoreline, along the sandy shoreline in their case, there's a lot of human impacts along the shore, along the Pacific coast. It's harder than it used to be, I suspect, for these birds to find undisturbed nesting sites. And the guess that, in chatting with Dave about this bird nesting there, one of the things we wondered is, well, the fact that that particular piece of beach is closed during the harbor seal pupping season might be a factor. And there's talk about trying to close it all year, which, myself, I would be a fan of that. Right, right. If you're a bird like an oystercatcher that's nesting right there on the shore, people with dogs off leash, toddlers that like to chase birds and watch them fly. All of these things are, make it more difficult for a bird that is living in that habitat, and especially trying to raise babies in that habitat to be successful. So suitable nest sites really is one of the main constraints on black oystercatchers population size. So it was exciting that this pair of oystercatchers tried to nest there. And if you go to this page, I have a whole description of the event and what went on. Basically, these birds tried to nest. They established a nest and they were incubating a single egg there right by where the seals haul out, right below the overlook where we're going to be on Saturday. And I was very excited. I hadn't had a chance to see them, and I went there to see them. And the day I went to see them, there was no nest there. And what actually happened was the day before there was a high wind event and a bunch of sand came in and covered the nest. So, which is, a thing that happens when you're nesting on a beach. It's a very dynamic environment. So shortly after that, presumably the same pair re-nested over a little bit to the, here's a pair of photos that Dave took. This is the oystercatcher at its nest. And this is what that nest site looked like the next day. Yeah, it's hard to, yeah, it's hard, especially with the snowy plover nesting. Like some of us have done docent duties down at the beach where the snowy plovers have been trying to, right? Yeah, thanks. Don't miss your train. I've never heard of this. That's really cool. Yeah, thank you. It's, as I say, it's a very dynamic environment. It's an unpredictable environment. Black oystercatchers nesting success percentage is kind of on the low side compared to what you might, expect for a breeding bird to be able to do. I think it's just kind of a fact of life for them living in that environment that not all of their nests make it, and this one did not. So then they subsequently they created another nest a little bit. You know what? Let me go actually look at a map. Oops. It's hard for me to type with my hands like this, but we'll do it. Because I can show you where this actually happened. So here's basically where the overlook is, and the seal haul out spot is down here. The original nest was right in these rocks right here. And then they subsequently made a nest up on the cliffs a little bit above the waterline over here by this parking lot. And I don't know how many eggs were in that nest. Black oystercatchers typically have 1 to 3 eggs in their nest. And those eggs got pretty close to hatching, or maybe did reach hatching. But then immediately after that, the birds weren't around and there were no chicks around. So presumably, if they did hatch, the chicks were predated, and so that nesting attempt failed as well. But it was very exciting that those 2 attempts happened in that spot, even if they did not actually succeed. I'm not aware of any other nesting records along the south coast, but maybe they're doing it in a spot that's out of the way and people just don't know about it. I think they are nesting successfully down at Rincon Island, this place in Ventura County, just over the border that I was talking about before. So that is my bit on oystercatchers nesting. And again, they do nest and are doing quite well out on the Channel Islands. So it's good that they have that area that is pretty protected from human disturbances, so they can do their thing. Yeah, let's keep going. This is a photo of the bird on the nest at that second site. So this was in June, so a little bit later than that earlier attempt. And this again, I think the nest is right around there. And this was just shortly after that, when I was walking the beach, kind of looking around. We were all, excited to look for young oystercatchers running around on the beach, but we couldn't find any. And this adult was checking me out. I don't think it wanted me coming to the vicinity of where its nest had been, so I turned around. And this is one that I photographed just a few weeks ago up at Moonstone Beach. And at the time, I wasn't aware that, yeah, this is a relatively young bird, and that's why its orange does not, presumably, and that's why its orange doesn't extend all the way out. So presumably this is like a 1 to 2 year old bird. Those with more oystercatcher expertise could probably get more specific than that. So now I want to talk about this other topic, which is weird looking oystercatchers, at least for where we are. And it's an interesting topic to me. And just as preface, I know a lot of people have seen this kind of fun documentary that came out recently called Listers, where these 2 brothers who are sort of beginners at bird watching decide to have a big year and go around the country and look for rare birds and document their adventures. Highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. It's on YouTube. But one of the scenes in that documentary that really hit home with me is the one where one of the brothers is getting an email from the eBird reviewers, and you're such and such observation, and just the way they grumble kind of about, oh, these darned eBird reviewers taking my birds away, reaching out to me and say, yeah, I don't think you really saw that. Well, it's just kind of a thing that happens when less experienced birders, like all of us have been at one point, get excited about seeing birds, which all of us have been through also. You start to want to see these unusual birds. And again, for a less experienced bird watcher who sees a bird like this one that I saw in Ventura back in 2022, you look at it and you go, wow, that does not look like an American, that does not look like a black oystercatcher. It looks like the other oystercatcher in the field guide, which is the American oystercatcher. So it is not at all uncommon for a bird like this in California to be reported as an American oystercatcher. There was another one that I photographed on the beach in Carp back in 2024. And again, looking at that bird, it's like, oh, wow. If you're just trying to match the bird with the pictures in the field guide, it is a very easy kind of trap to fall into to say, wow, I got an American oystercatcher. But it turns out that it's trickier than that because of hybrids and hybridism. So there is this population of American oystercatchers, again, on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. There's a population of black oystercatchers on the Pacific coast. And then there is this kind of interesting population of birds in the Sea of Cortez that I believe are typically talked of as a subspecies of the American oystercatcher that kind of look like this bird. And then there are hybrids. There are birds that represent, a mating between an American and a black oystercatcher. And then as those birds kind of have chicks and you get more generations, maybe they get more black oystercatcher-y looking. Um, but they're tricky, and according to the authorities that I've been reading up on in trying to prepare for this talk, and some of the people in this meeting know a lot more about this than I do. So this is a point where I'm going to encourage those who have more knowledge about this than I do to feel free to unmute and start chiming in. Just don't wait for an invitation. Um, but a lot of the birds that we see that look sort of American-ish in Santa Barbara County, which again is very few birds, this is a rare thing to see around here, are in fact hybrids. They are birds that don't look like pure American oyster catchers, and they don't look at all like black oyster catchers, but they don't, so they presumably are some sort of hybrid, which if you're playing the game of trying to get birds on your list so your count goes higher, is really disappointing because hybrids don't count. And this is, again, a silly kind of arbitrary side effect of playing this arbitrary game, because they're still awesome birds and they're really interesting in their own right. But if all you care about is a tick on your list, it's a bird that you don't want to see. You want to see the pure one so you can count it. And I say you, I'm talking about me of a certain era. I think these days I'm more enlightened about this, and I tend to try and appreciate the birds just on their own sakes. So now I want to talk about a specific bird, a specific individual bird, and this will be the last thing we talk about, that was seen out at Halama Beach, which is what this view is of, in, I want to say, January, so just a month or so ago. And I'm going to go ahead again and link out to some resources and just kind of touch on those briefly. So here is, again, Steve Colwell's bird view tool, and we can see these 4 different records reporting American oystercatcher right here at Halama. And my understanding is that these sat in the review queue, the eBird reviewers queue, for a while, until last week or so, when after a lot of discussion, some of it in sort of private email chains, some of which I saw, some of which I'm sure I didn't see, it was decided that, yeah, these birds look good enough to count as American. This single bird, looks good enough to count as an American oyster catcher. But it was kind of tricky because it was sort of close to the line. And the line itself is kind of, I don't know, less satisfying than you'd like it to be some ways. So we'll talk about that. Actually, first, I'm going to show you some photos that Hugh, who's in the meeting, Hugh Ranson, shared with me. And to do that, I think I have to stop. Yeah, I think I have to stop sharing and then start sharing again. And for that, I have to find my meeting controls. This is all very complicated for me. No, that's not what I want. I want the meeting controls. Oh, they're at the bottom of the screen. Silly me. We're going to share and we're going to look at these. So these are some photos of a bird that Hugh saw back in 2011, I think, Hugh, is that right?
Yeah, June of 2011.
And so the commentary on these photos, which Hugh had shared with some of these reviewers during this recent discussion about the Halama bird, were that, yeah, this bird actually looks about as pure American as you're going to see in California, as you're likely to see in California. This is a really good-looking candidate for an actual genetically pure American oyster catcher. And there are details like you want this white bar on the wing to be thicker, and you want the white upper tail coverts to be uninterrupted by black and more extensive. And you want there to be you want this all to be white down here, and you want this border between the black and the white to be a sharply defined border, not a messy border. And it's a lot of details. But again, so if you've looked at this bird, so now you have an idea of what is a high scoring oyster catcher. And now we'll go look at some of these other birds. We'll look at some photos of this one other bird, this halama bird. And to view that, I think probably I'll do this. And there's Sophie's checklist. Let's go look at Sophie's photos. So again, it can be hard to get a good look at the important parts of the bird. So you can see here, its upper tail coverts are not pure white. There's some dark feathers in there. Its wing stripe is not super broad and white. It's kind of a little narrower. Another view. Kind of see what's going on the legs and the undersides here. Okay, so this is sort of like the analyzing the Zapruder film, right? To try and answer the question of, who shot Kennedy? There's a lot of little details, and the more you get into it, the kind of deeper the rabbit hole goes. And to talk about that, we need to talk briefly about the gel scale. So Joseph R. Gell, Jr., who I don't think is around. He lived in San Diego and did a lot down there at he was a prominent ornithologist who wrote a lot of cool papers, including this one that we're going to talk about. I think these days he lives in Annapolis. Not sure. Anyway, one of the things he did that decades worth of birding people concerned about black versus American oystercatcher ID have probably been grateful for is he wrote a paper in 1985 which included this table. And what my understanding is that what Gell did is he looked at a bunch of specimens, a bunch of museum specimens of different oystercatchers from both species, and he attempted to create this formula that you could use. So you could look at a bird, and assuming you could see all these features, you could score it. Okay, so like the upper tail coverts, if they're black, as in Bachmani, which is the black oystercatcher, you get 0 points. If you're white, as in Palliatus, the American oystercatcher, you get 4 points. And you go down this whole list of features and you assign points for each of these characteristics. And when you're done, you add them all up. And my understanding is that according to Gell's research, his position was if you scored 30 points or higher, if the bird scored 30 points or higher, it was probably an American oystercatcher. And so if you were scoring below that point, it was more likely that you were talking about a hybrid bird, a black oystercatcher crossed with an American oystercatcher. And this is useful for people like eBird reviewers, or just, until they stopped weighing in until they decided it wasn't, for the California Bird Records Committee at a certain point, decided that they were no longer going to have people report their oystercatchers for analysis by them. They decided that was not a species they were going to concern themselves with, or a species pair. But for those who want to identify their oystercatchers, this is very useful. So with Sophie's photos that we just were looking at, and with Sue Cook's photos, who I believe was also in the meeting, we had good enough looks at that bird that a bunch of the local reviewers weighed in on it and kind of independently scored it, and people compared their scores. And I think initially the scores ranged from about 28 points to about 32 points. And then they kind of talked back and forth and talked about the nitty-gritty details. And eventually, I think, and again, I don't want to mischaracterize this because I wasn't in all these conversations, but I think the consensus became, yeah, it's probably a 30-point plus-ish bird and can probably be accepted as an American oystercatcher. So it was, in fact, accepted, at least for eBird purposes, as an American oystercatcher. So having said all that, Hugh, I know you were interested in this. Paul Lehman is in the meeting, and if he's willing to kind of, emerge from the shadows and weigh in, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this bird in particular, or maybe about the larger question of trying to distinguish between these hybrids or pure oystercatchers of various species.
Yeah, I'll start off. What was kind of interesting to me was I've always had a tough time putting birds through this gel scoring system, partly because photographs are often not quite good enough to to see is there any is that black flecking? Is it shadows? Is it just a gap between the feathers? To really analyze it. And it became interesting when there was a little email thread going between uh, Paul Lehman, Curtis Morantz, Dave Compton, and myself, and we all had slightly different scores, and we were kind of going back and forth. Well, what exactly does it mean by the thighs are pure white? Where exactly are the thighs, and how can you see how wide the wing stripe is on the folded wing? It gives you a certain amount of millimeters. I mean, if you got the bird in the hand, that's one thing, but just looking at pictures, how can you tell? It's tough.
Your feed. Sophie also had a laughing gull, so that was quite a day she had out there at Halama. It's saying my internet connection. Maybe ever. Okay, well, oh, you're moving again, Hugh. Please continue.
Okay,
Maybe
I don't
just
know.
come
I
back.
don't know where I left off.
Give me like the last 20 seconds over again.
Okay, so did you hear me talking about the kind of discussion between four of us?
You were just starting to talk about that, yeah.
Okay, and so that was really interesting, and it just how four different people can analyze things. Fairly experienced birders can see things a little differently. But I think by the end of it, we all kind of came together into that kind of 30-ish range.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Well, if anybody else who's in the meeting and has the ability to unmute and discuss this, wants to unmute and discuss this, that would be great. In the meantime, I'm going to point out one more resource that's kind of interesting. And this is a blog post from back in 2013 from the Seagull Steve blog, where Seagull Steve goes into a lot of detail about the gel scale and about this question of scoring and distinguishing between hybrids and the Frazari subspecies of American oystercatcher, which I believe is the subspecies that is living in like the Sea of Cortez area. So it's long and detailed, but really interesting. And he shows a bunch of oystercatchers and talks about their features and talks about the difficulty of, for birds that are kind of in that middle range, how it is in fact difficult to know sometimes what you actually have. And if I can, sort of summarize my take on his take, one of the things that I think does come through is his attitude that to some degree the stringer impulse, which I guess is stringer is sort of a disparaging term for a birder who really wants to count a bird, so they upgrade a bird to the bird they want without necessarily doing the proper objective conservative assessment before they make that choice. That people want to see an American oystercatcher, and because of these ambiguities and the difficulty of actually scoring the bird, and maybe some inherent kind of ambiguity in the scoring of these Frazari subspecies and these hybrid birds, that it is an easy trap to fall into. That if you start from the perspective of, oh, I want this to be an American and I'm going to try and justify that, there's enough gray area there that you'll probably succeed, but you may be succeeding more often than you should be. And that, in his view, it's more appropriate to assume that these birds are hybrids until proven otherwise, and then, kind of hold the line and require a pretty high degree of evidence to decide that they are in fact American. And again, it was very interesting to me, just in the case of this particular bird out at Halama, to see, how much effort went into it, how much thought and independent, like 5 or so people independently scoring the bird and then comparing their scores and talking about what it meant, and long discussions, again, not all of which I even saw. So it was sort of interesting and fun to me to see that all play out. But again, for me as a beginning birder, I had no idea, that this was a thing. And the first time I saw a bird that I thought, wow, it looks like an American oyster catcher out at Anacapa Island, maybe 10 years ago or longer, and put it in eBird and got an email from the, Ventura eBird reviewer saying, actually, there's a good chance this is a hybrid, and how well did you see it? And I didn't have any photo documentation. So, you know, it was very educational. But with any luck on Saturday, when we go out to see uh, our birds at the seal haul out, there may be a black oyster catcher there. There could be an interesting oyster catcher with a white belly there. It's happened before. But that pretty much covers what I was going to talk about with oyster catchers. Sort of a quick meeting tonight. I see Paul has enabled his camera. So Paul, with everybody. I'd be very interested in hearing your comments about anything about this topic, Paul.
Yeah, first, just a comment or two about black oyster catcher. They really have increased throughout Southern California, south of Point Conception, in the last 20 years on the mainland. There always were on the north coast, down to the north coast of Santa Barbara County, down to right around Point Conception, and of course out on the Channel Islands. But south of Point Conception, they were solely a rare visitor. And in my days living in Santa Barbara, 70s and 80s, if I saw one individual every other year, maybe that was pretty good. Typically, it was a spring bird at Goleta Point. Campus Point was sort of the hot spot when we were doing sea watches anyway then. But anyway, they've clearly increased. Now that you have, the seal haul out, regular numbers there every year, it seems they're more regular elsewhere on the South Coast. Also, your breeding record failed, but clearly a breeding record. First one for the South Coast perfectly fits in with the first breeding record for Orange County just a couple years ago, and the first couple records for San Diego County, where I live. The first record, surprisingly, or maybe not, was on Point Loma a couple years ago, and it involved a black oyster catcher and a hybrid. That was the pairing. Then last year in La Jolla, we had a pure pair of black oyster catchers. All of these have failed. Typically, predation of either the egg or the chick. The adults, if they're not standing right next to the chick at all times, which is impossible, a western gull, or down here, great blue heron has been a culprit. So far, none successful, but at least they got to the early chick stage. Anyway, they've increased in the last 10 to 20 years, clearly, and the Santa Barbara situation fits right into that. Hybrids, the question on Fraseri, or however you want to pronounce it, is that a valid subspecies of American oyster catcher, or is it simply a hybrid swarm? And that's a good question. Also, clearly the Baja birds all look like that, but then you get down to the Gulf of California or even mainland Mexico below that, they start looking better for American, but they're still a little dicey. The cleanest American type oyster catcher ever seen in California, Hughes bird, was pretty close, but it's actually a family group that turned up at the Salton Sea of all places in the late 70s. One year they stayed almost a month, and they obviously came out of the Gulf of California and up to the Salton Sea, and they looked as pristine and like the pure driven snow, pretty much as like a bird you'd see on the Gulf Coast, Atlantic coast, which is surprising because even the birds in the Gulf often look a little tainted, but these things look really good, and those are by far the best ones. All the ones here on the outer coast are at varying degrees of slight taintedness. Can you go back? Just my last comment is on can you go back to the Ventura Harbor bird?
Yeah, let me do that. I think I want this.
Yeah. Paul, while John's doing that, could you speak to whether American oyster catchers would be more usually seen on a beach rather than on the rocks, or?
That's true back east. Back east they're a beach and mudflat bird, but Fraseri, whatever the hell Fraseri is, is more rocky coast, although down in the Gulf and mainland Mexico, south of Baja, they start occurring again on sandy beaches and this and that. So, uh, yeah, back east, clearly. But yeah, that picture is the one I want. The one you,
This one?
yeah.
Okay.
So it was interesting, just real quick on, as Hugh mentioned, one mark that's tough to analyze in the gel scale is the width of the white on the leading edge of the wing at rest, because that's a measurement. How many millimeters? If it's so many, it's this. If it's between this and this, you get this many points. And again, how the heck do you measure that in a photo? Gel was using specimens, so of course he could measure them exactly. And the other one that caused issues for us in this one is the thighs. And can you see my cursor?
No, I cannot. We're talking
Okay.
about this
So
photo, though?
if you treat the thighs as really just those feathers covering the base of the leg,
Uh-huh.
yeah, they're pure white. At least they look that way, but they're always pure white in these. Even the intermediate birds are kind of white. But then if you go straight up toward the base of the wing, then you start getting all that dusky stuff.
Yeah.
And I treated that as sort of the upper thighs, and so gave it a much lower score than Hugh, who was treating the thighs as only the feathers that cover the base of the leg, which were indeed pure white. And that difference was 2 points, and it was enough to either have it 29 non-countable or 31 countable, which of course gives you an idea of how, right on the edge this is and how artificial it almost is, that this scale. So you have to take this whole thing with a bit of a grain of salt. But anyway, that was sort of the little history of that and the interpretation. Obviously, I should, Joe Gell is still alive. He's 90 something and yeah, lives in Maryland. His son lives here in San Diego, and I know him well. I really should have his son get a hold of him and say, what did you really mean by the thighs? Is it just, you
Right.
know, but we haven't done that. But anyway, that's a little history of that. But man, by the way, and a lot of these hybrids are ending up 28, 29, 27 at the worst. We're not talking 21, 22. There are birds like that. But a lot of these problematic birds are barely not good enough.
Yeah.
Or the ones we're counting are 30, 31. They're barely good enough. Yeah, they're not like the Salton Sea birds or that one bird you had years ago, which are more comfortably in the American. So it's, yeah, we count them sometimes, we don't count them others, but man, it's a real close call, and as you said, it's all just a listing game, so
Well, and
whatever.
I imagine, for people like yourself, I mean, you've, devoted a large part of your professional life to like mapping where these birds are and talking about these fine distinctions. And I assume that on some level it must be frustrating, or maybe you just accommodate yourself to the reality that, well, reality is messy, and I'm trying to
Yeah.
reduce it to a set of specifics that I could put on a map or put in a description or, put on a confirm, no confirm treatment of an eBird report. But the reality is, fuzzy and sort of it's a gray area, and you have to kind of make a judgment call.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciated getting that input. Um, I will officially declare the meeting done unless anyone else has any other comments they want to make. This is your last opportunity. You're waving goodbye, Hugh? Okay. Yeah, so long, Hugh. So long, everybody else. Thank you very much for coming out. I look forward to seeing some of you on Saturday out at the Bluffs. And again, if we're lucky, we keep our fingers crossed, maybe we'll see an oyster catcher or two. Thanks.